Hello, this is Warcrime Zuwu, and I'd love to thank you for joining me for another installment of my favorite series to do on this channel, my limited guides. I don't know how excited you guys are. I am pretty excited for Dominaria United, the upcoming set. We're going back to Dominaria. I'm usually not a huge Dominaria guy. I'm not really emotionally connected to the lore. You know, my first set was Scars of Mirrodin, and my favorite set was Khans of Tarkir. But this set looks like it's really mechanically interesting. It looks like there's a lot to dig into in terms of the way that this draft format's going to work. And I'm excited to give my thoughts on some of these cards and help you guys make up your mind for the sealed and draft events you'll be going to. So this is our limited guide for pre-release and draft for Dominaria United. This is intended for players going into their limited formats who just want the quick and dirty on the archetypes of the set, the cards to look out for, and different things that might be going on when you're actually playing sealed and draft. We're going to discuss the play patterns of some of these important cards. It's not a review of every card in the set, but it is intended to give you the information you need to improve your performance in Limited. And it's expected that maybe you've done a little bit of Limited before, some drafts, some sealed. But if you haven't, go ahead and join us. And I'm excited to show you how this works. So, what we'll be covering today are the new and returning mechanics for the set and how they work, the best cards in each color to look out for while playing the set, the limited archetypes, including some signpost cards that explain like what kind of decks you're going to realistically be able to build in draft and sealed, the tips and tricks, just things that I think will help you get the edge over your opponents, and then the best bombs in the format. So for those of you who aren't aware, we typically focus entirely on commons and uncommons in these guides. Because that is most of what you'll see in Limited, and a good Limited player should be able to win with a draft or sealed deck, well, a draft deck at least, that doesn't feature any rares, and just relies on the synergy of the cards that they drafted from the common and uncommon slot, which is, like I said, more than 90% of the cards that you're actually going to be drafting and using in your deck. So, without further ado, let's begin with the new and returning mechanics. So this is the only new, well, one of two new mechanics in the set. This is Enlist. So this is sort of a fixed version of banding, but it only works on attacking. It's not really a blocking-centered mechanic. Essentially, when your creature with Enlist attacks, you may tap a non-attacking creature you control without summoning sickness, and when you do, add its power to the creatures until end of turn. So essentially, the creature that you're tapping to assist your Enlist creature is not actually attacking, it's not actually entering combat, but it is lending its power to the creature that enlisted it, the creature with Enlist. This means that if the creature you tap has lifelink, it does not give lifelink to the enlisting creature, for instance, but you can tap your 3/1 with your 2/2 Enlister, and then the Enlister attacks as a 5/2. Remember, it also does not grant toughness, but it allows you in these gummed up board states to sort of swing in with a creature your opponent's not going to want to trade with. If you've got 2/2s with Enlist and he's got a 4/4, you can swing with your Enlist creature essentially being a 4/2, and then if he trades, he's really trading with the power of both of your creatures, but you get to keep one. That's one of the sort of play patterns with this mechanic. And we see a few creatures with Enlist in the set that have a mechanic that cares about their power. We'll get to those shortly. But essentially, what this aims to do is just give more relevance to your creatures on the ground in a gummed-up board state. I think it's going to play interestingly in Limited. I think it's pretty easy to evaluate these cards. Generally, I would consider Enlist to be not quite at the value of Flying, probably a little bit not as strong. It's definitely a very aggressive mechanic. And I think once we've played a little bit, it'll be clear whether these Enlist commons stand out or it should just be evaluated similarly or slightly less than Flying. So here are two examples. We've got Benelish Faithbonder and Coalition Warbrute. One of them is 1 and a white for a 1/3 Vigilance Enlist, Human Cleric. And one of them is 3 and a red for a 3/4 Minotaur Berserker with Trample and Enlist. And these are both at common in the set, so stuff to look out for. But we're going to go over more as we go through the set. So the other new mechanic... Oh, I'm sorry, there's 3 new mechanics. I apologize. One of the other new mechanics is Read Ahead. Now, this is only on Sagas, and they have stated this is not just how Sagas are going to work in the future. This is just for this set. So these are the first Sagas we've seen without the reminder text on there. They kind of expect us, after getting them in so many sets, to just know how they work. But where that reminder text was is a new mechanic, Read Ahead, and the rules text for Read Ahead is choose a chapter and start with that many lore counters. Add one after your draw step. Skipped chapters don't trigger. Sacrifice after 3. So essentially what this means is that these sagas, you can select which chapter you'd like to start on. You can skip the first chapter, or even just skip the second chapter and get that third. Whichever one is most important to you at the time. So some of these will have like a symmetrical effect for the first chapter, and if it wouldn't be advantageous to give you and your opponent that advantage, you can skip that chapter. Or some of them have their first chapter being something that's relevant only during part of the game. So if you're not in that stage of the game, you can skip the first chapter and immediately get the value of the second or third chapter. And the two I'm showing here are two uncommons. Obviously, there's no common sagas in this set, but we're looking at the Weatherseed Treaty, which is 2 and a green, Read Ahead saga. The first chapter is search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. The second is create a 1/1 green Sapperling creature token. And the third is target creature you control gets +X/+X and gains trample until end of turn, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. So, if you are in the stage of the game where ramping another land is just not going to be helpful to you, then you can skip that first mode, get the Sapperling, and then get the buff. Or if you just need the buff to finish off your opponent, you can just skip straight to the third part. And then we've got Love Song of Night and Day. I love this. This is a classic sort of within the lore of Magic. This is a piece of media that exists. This is a poem that's referenced in flavor text throughout the game's history, and it's getting its own card as a saga. I think that's really neat. But what it does, it's 2 and a white for a saga with Read Ahead. For chapter 1, you and target opponent each draw 2 cards. So we got a little secret rendezvous action going on there. And then for chapter 2, you get a 1/1 white bird token with flying. Very nice. For chapter 3, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Now, the way that I feel like this is going to work is typically you are going to skip the first chapter because, as anyone who understands card advantage would know, you are giving your opponent a free card here. If you're drawing 2 cards but you're spending the Love Song of Night and Day, then you're almost always going to skip chapter 1. I have trouble thinking of a scenario in which you are going to use chapter 1. But chapter 2, you get a 1/1 flyer, and that's 3 mana, that's fine. Chapter 3, you put a +1/+1 counter of each of up to 2 target creatures, and that's where the card starts to look worth it. You pay 3 mana, you get your 1/1 bird. Next turn, before the bird gets a chance to attack, you're putting a +1/+1 counter on it, and another creature. So I think Love Song of Night and Day is going to be a solid white card. But essentially, these are just here to show you how Read Ahead works. The other new mechanic is stun counters. So this is going to be an evergreen mechanic as well. They're going to keep using these in every set. I think it's really neat. Essentially, what it means is if a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, remove a stun counter from it instead. So aside from the way that these work with Proliferate, where essentially if you have something that proliferates out, they will never untap it because you'll put another stun counter on it, and then they'll try to untap it, they'll remove a stun counter, go back to your turn, you put another stun counter on it, if you can proliferate every turn, with something like Atraxa and Commander or whatever. But if we're just talking about this limited format, obviously there's no proliferate. And essentially the function that the stun counters serve is those cards that used to be tap a creature, it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Now you get to remember that with a counter, and if you use 2 of those on it, you get 2 turns of untapping. It stacks now. And then, of course, there's cards that put multiple stun counters, like our Impede Momentum here. So we'll just go over Frostfist Strider, 3 and double blue for an uncommon 4/4 Elemental Giant. Ward 2, and when it enters the battlefield, tap target creature and opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So, just a good body with a tap effect. And then we've got Impede Momentum, 1 and a blue for a sorcery at common. Tap target creature and put 3 stun counters on it. Scry 1. So 3 turns that creature is going to remain tapped before it is allowed to untap. And I think these stun counters are a little bit difficult to evaluate. I don't want to liken them to just like Heliod's Punishment from Theros Beyond Death or something where you just you have a few turns and you get it back. It is kind of like that. But there's no cost to them removing the stun counters. It's just eventually going to come back. I think, Frostfist Strider is obviously good enough that the stun counter is just like a nice little bonus. But in terms of cards that just put stun counters on them, I think it has to be a lot before you consider it essentially removing the creature. And I don't think Impede Momentum quite hits that mark. But we'll have to see how they play in Limited. This is, like I said, a new mechanic. And then we've got 2 returning mechanics. The first one is Kicker. We last saw this in Zendikar Rising, and it seems to come back not quite as often as Cycling does, but pretty often. And these are just, I'm not going to read these out, these are just spells that you can pay an extra mana cost in addition, or sometimes it's not mana, but in this case it's always mana in this set. And the spell has some extra effect. So like there's a 2/2, a bear, that you kick it, and it, it comes in, you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control. Stuff like that. Some spells you kick them and you draw a card. It's just a little bonus effect. Worth noting in this set has a very weird relationship with the color pie, a very weird like multicolor, but we're not really trying to push the multicolor thing going on. So every kicker cost on a card in this set is a different color than the spell's actual cost. So something to pay attention to, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. And then that's the only returning mechanic. So now, well, other than, Flying Trampled as evergreen mechanics. So now we're going to discuss the best cards in each color. So regardless of what archetype you're trying to build, these are the cards in each color that you're going to be trying to look out for. These are the cards where if they're missing from your packs in draft, then it likely means that other people at the table are in these colors. And these are the cards to look out for and make sure your deck is kind of full of if you want to have a good deck in these colors. So as usual, we're going to go in WUBRG order. We're going to start with white. These are what I think are the best white cards in the set. So speaking of kicker, this first one is Runic Shot. It's an uncommon sorcery for a single white, and you can kick it for a blue, so for a white and a blue. Destroy target tapped creature. If the spell is kicked, scry 2. We have never seen a 1-mana sorcery that destroys target tapped creature, to my knowledge. So this is huge. Anything that attacked on your opponent's last turn, if you are later in the game, 1 mana is going to matter a lot less. You can make your big play for the turn and still pop their creature for a single mana, which I think is really meaningful. This is one of those spells also that you just don't really need to kick. Like the blue kicker's on there and it's cool to scry to, but you are going to be happy to play this in a white-red deck. So that's Runic Shot. Another uncommon we've got here, Knight of Dawn's Light. This is 1 and a white for a 2/2 uncommon human knight. With first strike, if you would gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead. And then for 1 and a white, Knight of Dawn's Light gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So that gain life text is not going to be terribly relevant. You'll gain maybe 1 or 2 life off of this over the course of the game, but that is just kind of there. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, the threat of activation on that ability for 1 and a white is insane, especially when paired with first strike. It is very, very awkward for your opponent to block this creature, and that is what I think gives it a lot of its power. On the later turns, on the early turns, you just have a 2/2 first strike, and if they can't play a 4/4, you can swing with it. If they've got a 3/3, you pump it and eat their 3/3 if they block. And if they don't block, you just get in for 2, which they're not going to block. They don't want you to eat their 3/3. So it's an excellent aggressive card. It's an equally excellent card to sit behind. First strike has a long history of being a great defensive ability. And the threat of activation on that ability just makes it, I can't imagine a white deck that I wouldn't want more and more Knight of Dawn's Light in this format. This card is excellent. That threat of activation is just brutal. Speaking of brutal, we've got this Destroy Evil here. It's 1 and a white for an instant. This is a common. Choose one. Destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, or destroy target enchantment. Now, those of you might remember Repel Evil from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. This is 2 less mana, and the only difference is that it destroys instead of exiling, which is very seldom going to bite you. I think this is definitely good enough for main board inclusion, probably up to 2, maybe 3 copies, because that toughness 4 or greater, a lot of their later game action is going to be hit by that. And then just being able to have the reassurance that there's enchantment destruction in your main board. Maybe they play a Saga, maybe they play some other enchantment that you want to get rid of. The fact that your decent creature removal also has that rider on it is going to be really relevant. Not as relevant as it was in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, where maybe that effect needed to cost 4 mana in order to make it not feel awful to play those enchantment creatures that were really abundant in that format. But just the fact that you can destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater for 2 mana at instant speed and then have that extra reassurance against enchantments is phenomenal. So those are what I think are the best cards in white. And then we're going to talk about blue. So we've got Frostfist Strider. We met him earlier, that 5-mana 4/4 Elemental Giant at uncommon with Ward 2. When it comes in, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. This card's awesome. That Ward 2 is really meaningful. It takes a removal spell they might want to cast on this and takes it from being something they can do offhand to it taking their whole turn to play it. If they're working with a 4-mana removal spell, then that's their curve. They have to have 6 mana to deal with this, which is pretty great. And then just the fact that if they don't, it's a 4/4 body, which is respectable. That's the type of body that moves you into the mid-game where 2/2s are just not relevant anymore. And then the fact that if they have already hit that stage of the game and they have something bigger, you can tap it down while you find a way to deal with it. I think Frostfist Strider's excellent. Next, we've got Tolarian Terror. Now, this is 6 and a blue for a common 5/5, and it's part of a cycle of creatures that cost less based on something the color cares about. In this case, for the Tolarian Terror, it costs 1 less to cast for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and this guy has Ward 2 as well. So there's a few ways you can go about doing this. You can do the self-mill route. There's plenty of cards that sort of put things in your own graveyard, in blue-black especially, or you can just cast a lot of instants and sorceries. And if you discount this by even 2 mana, it's on curve. It's a 5-mana 5/5 Ward 2, which is phenomenal. If you can discount this by more and have like a turn where you're casting multiple spells, where you're casting this for 4 and then maybe playing a 2-drop, then that is just backbreaking. A 5/5 with Ward 2 is excellent. It ends games. And the fact that it's pretty easy to enable this, you might remember Strixhaven Limited, where there was the 4-mana Fractal with a +1/+1 counter for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and I think this looks a little bit like that. It obviously doesn't have the crazy silly ceiling that card had because it tops out at a 5/5, but it is more realistic. It does cost less, and you can make this very cheap. You can make this, I think, very reasonably, a 4-mana 5/5 ward, which is great. And then we've got Talus Lookout. This is my pick for most surprising that they made it a common. Rather than an uncommon. There's not too much exile removal in the set. I guess I should get to what it does. It's 2 and double blue for a 3/2 human pirate with flying. And when Talus Lookout dies, look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. This is pretty crazy. Windrake is a sort of card that a lot of cards are compared against these days. It wouldn't really pass the sniff test in most limited formats now. But for a long time, it was just the standard for flyers, a 4-mana 3/2 flyer. That's how they cost them, right? Now we've got Windrake, but not only does it draw you a card when it dies, it gives you some card selection. You look at the top 2, you can put one in your hand and one in the yard. I think this card is phenomenal, and much like the Knight we looked at in the last pack, I can't imagine a blue deck that just doesn't want as many copies of this as they can get. This is the closest sort of thing to a Pizza Rhino in this set. I think this card's excellent. So I'm very excited to draft as many Talus Lookouts as I can get. Next, we'll move on to the best black cards. And as you can see, Knight of Dusk's Shadow is kind of the foil to Knight of Dawn's Light. It's sort of the opposite end. Now, Menace doesn't synergize with that Threat of Activation ability as well as First Strike did. Sorry, I've got to read the card. It's 1 and a black for an uncommon human knight, 2/2. Menace. Your opponents can't gain life. 1 and a black, Knight of Dusk's Shadow gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So I do think that shutting off your opponent's life gain is more important than increasing your own life gain by 1 per instance. So that's a useful effect. Does it make up for Menace not being as powerful with that Threat of Activation as First Strike? Kind of. With the First Strike, if your opponent blocks with 2 creatures that are big enough to kill it together, or one of them is big enough to kill it, then the Threat of Activation you can activate it and then eat the creature that was big enough to kill it, and then the other creature doesn't do enough damage to kill it. Whereas with Menace, if one of the creatures is big enough to kill the Knight of Dusk's Shadow after your pump, or before your pump, then you pump it, and then the Knight of Dusk's Shadow will still die to the 2 blockers. So it's not as synergistic, but that Threat of Activation is just as great. This is not a once per turn, nor was it on the white card. And the fact that every 2 mana is just making this 1/1 bigger is really, really cool. Then we've got Extinguish the Light. I think this is going to be sort of the staple black removal in this limited format. It's 2 and double black for an instant at common. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. If its mana value is 3 or less, you gain 3 life. So I think you want to look at this less as like, oh, there's an opportunity to gain life, and more as just, this is the consistent 4 mana instant. if you're in a game state where using it on something with 3 or less is valuable anyway, then great, you gain 3 life. But don't feel bad using this on a problematic 5-drop or something. And it's a common, so you'll be able to get plenty of copies of it. I think Extinguish the Light is good. And then we've got Splatter Goblin, a pretty good common. This is 1 and a black for a 2/1 Phyrexian Goblin with when Splatter Goblin dies, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So this is, I think, pretty useful. It really makes blocking awkward. You know, they block with a 3/3, this can trade. If they block it with anything and they have a 1/1 sitting around, you know, you get to kill the 1/1 for free. It's target creature. So I think Splatter Goblin will always make things awkward, both on attacking and blocking. And anything that makes your opponent have to do more math that might not end in their favor is good in my book. So Splatter Goblin's one common to look out for. Next, we'll look at red. So 2 of these cards have opposite kicker costs, but neither of them I think the kicker is necessary. Herloon Battle Hymn is 2 and a red for an instant uncommon. Kicker for a white. Herloon Battle Hymn deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If the spell was kicked, you gain 4 life. So that kicker is obviously cool if you're in a red-white deck, but 3 mana for 4 damage and instant speed removal, I think, is excellent in a limited format. So I'd be happy to get as many copies of this as I can. Then we got Viashino Branch Rider. Single red for a 1/1 Viashino Warrior. At common, with kicker 2 and a green, haste. If Viashino Branch Rider was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And for 2 and a red, Viashino Branch Rider gets +2/0 until end of turn. So this sort of not quite fire breathing. It's 3 mana for 2 more power rather than 1 mana per power. But, you know, the fact that in a green deck you can make this a 4 mana 3/3 haste is not lost on me. Like, that's fine. But even just as a 1 mana 1/1 haste, the fact that you can pump it later to trade with stuff, or if they don't block it, to just, you know, have that threat of activation, I think this card is a 1-drop that is very much worth playing. And so I'd be very happy to get this in a draft deck. And then we have the classic Lightning Strike, been in too many standards to count, classic reprint. It is just Lightning Bolt, but it costs 1 more mana. It's a 1 and a red for an instant, 3 damage to any target. Very simple card, powerful removal, and a way to just finish off your opponent. Sometimes you're in a game where they're at 3, and you've got the Lightning Strike, and you don't have to do any more math. You just kill them. And if you draft multiple Lightning Strikes, this thing's at common, you know, you be aggressive in the early game, they're at 6, you draw your second Lightning Strike, and you just end it right there. So the flexibility of being able to hit face is really nice, but this is just a 2 mana instant for 3 damage, and it's what it's often going to get used for is what it's best at, removal, answering your opponent's creatures. I think this card is great. And last but not least, we've got the best cards in green. Now, there's a few that I think are important to look at. Green definitely has some big guys in this format, some kind of, like, I guess you'd say Colossal Dreadmaws, but, like, not quite at that mana cost. So here we're going to look at Mossbeard Ancient. This is a 7 mana 7/7 trample. 7 is the mana cost where it kind of starts getting like, you know, maybe I won't get there in limited. But when it enters, you gain 5 life. So it's very much like this comes down, it's a threat, and if you were getting beaten down by aggro, you have a couple more turns to finish the game out with Mossbeard Ancient, which I like. And of course, that's an uncommon Treefolk, sorry. And then you got Nishoba Brawler, 1 and a green for an X3 Cat Warrior with Trample. And X is equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control. So this has domain, this is a flavor word. Essentially, it cares about the number of basic land types among lands you control. So, Nishoba Brawler is a 2/3 trample in the average deck, although if you're playing a 3-color deck, or if you have those off-color duels we're going to talk about in a little bit, then this is potentially a 3/3, maybe a 4/3. Nishoba Brawler, I think, should not be overlooked. And just having a 2-mana 2/3 trample, that's one of the best 2-drops you can get in a limited format. So be happy to get these. And then you've got Elfheim Worm. I think this is going to be the common sort of curve topper for aggressive decks or going into the mid-game creature. This is 4 and a green for a 5/4 worm with vigilance and trample. Very simple common, 2 powerful keywords. The fact that you don't have to think about whether you want to block with it, whether you want to be able to block with this when you swing. You know, maybe they trade then, but if they don't, it's still a blocker. And it's a 5/4, you know, that's a considerable body. They're often going to have to block with 2 things to trade this. And then you're getting, you know, the sort of board advantage that you need here. So Next, we've got the limited archetypes. So I'm going to be going over the different things that the different color combinations will be trying to do in this format. So first we've got white and blue flyers. And I'm not going to read all of these cards, but I am going to talk about the sort of play patterns that these decks are going to be going through. So Mesa Cavalier is 2 and a white for a 2/1 flyer. When it comes in, you gain 3 life, or gain 2 life. That's a common, not quite inspiring Overseer, but a pretty good card. And then you've got, Combat Research, sort of this inspiration type effect, but it's very aggressively costed. This the exploration, the card from Ixalan that when you hit them you draw. It's when you hit them you draw a card, but you don't have to sack it if they don't attack. And the +1/+1 is conditional on it being legendary, of course. But it does also get Ward 1 if it's legendary, and there's lots of uncommon legendaries. But the point is, you put this on a flyer, and you're drawing a card every time it hits your opponent. If you do it once and then they remove it, you're even on card advantage. And if they don't, you're doing great. I think it's very, very powerful. So that is sort of the blue-white flyer or white-blue flyers archetype. It's just getting in. You want to play some ground creatures with high toughness to gum up the board as quickly as possible, because that's the state you win the game in. You put some guys in the air and just start swinging at them. Then we've got blue-black, which is just this classic control archetype. There's a turtle with a mana sink that lets you scry. Vohar Vodalian Desecrator is a signpost uncommon in blue-black that lets you filter your draws and kind of acts as a poor man's Snapcaster for an important removal spell. And then we've got Tribute to Urborg. It's just an on-curve removal spell that'll remove something that costs 2, but if you kick it, it does more. So it's just very much this sort of answer your opponent's important threats, put down walls, eventually be plussing on card advantage and sort of play a threat that kills your opponent. So this is a classic control archetype in blue-black. Next we've got black-red. This is something that a lot of sets recently have done, and I don't think it's quite at the level of Spellslingers where I really don't want to see blue-red just do that again, but it does feel like black-red's an aggressive sacrifice deck has really been the go-to for black-red in a lot of recent sets. So I would like him to change it up, but they're giving it some cool cards here. We've got Cult Conscript, which almost feels like a better Gutter Bones at uncommon. It's a black for a 2/1, comes in tapped. 1 and a black, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only if a non-skeleton creature died under your control this turn. So obviously you can't just return it off of its own death. That'd be pretty powerful. But as you'll see in this archetype, it's not hard to make that happen. And a 1-mana 2/1 that comes in tapped, as you know, is basically a 2-drop that you can play on turn 1 if you draw it. Lagomos, Hand of Hatred is the sort of signpost uncommon. That fetch ability is not going to happen. If it does, something crazy has happened in the game, and you're not going to be evaluating it the way you evaluate a normal limited game anyway. But essentially, you get a 2/1 trample haste every turn that you sack at the end of the turn, which will allow you can sack it to other things, since you're going to have to sack it anyway. And it's an elemental, it's not a skeleton, so Cult Conscript can come back if you draft both of those uncommons together. But essentially, there's a lot of black and red cards that demand you sacrifice creatures. Lagomos gives you a creature to sacrifice every turn. He himself does not have to attack. And that creature, sometimes they're just going to be able to eat the creature every turn if they have a 3/3 or something. But if they don't, it's 2 free damage every turn. They're not going to block it because it's going to sack at the end of the turn anyway. So I think this is the most aggressive deck in the format, and it's what black-red's trying to do. Next, we've got red-green, which is sort of a domain ramp aggro. This one has kind of a confused identity. So perhaps I should have discussed there's common tapped lands that have 2 basic land types, essentially. So they're like shock lands you can't shock in, or the snow lands from Kaldheim, just not snow. Essentially, so you've got a forest island that enters the battlefield tapped, and swamp plains that enters the battlefield tapped, like that sort of thing. And there's 10 of them, and you're going to get one in most packs. So red-green is domain ramp aggro, and Sprouting Goblin is the only really efficient way to grab those out. So he's 1 and a red for 2/2 with Kicker for a green. When he enters the battlefield, if he was kicked, you fetch a land card with a basic land type and put it in your hand. So this can be a basic land, or it can be one of those tapped duels. And you can pay a red, tap, and sack a land to draw cards. So late in the game, he can turn your land top decks into gas, which is very helpful. And the big thing with that kicker, if you're in a red-green deck, but you have enough cards that care about domain, maybe you've drafted a black-white tapped land, so you stick that in there, and then when you draw it, you're not really treating it like a land, you're treating it as all my domain cards are +2 now. So then you've got Rulik Mon's Warren Chief. He's just a pretty good, he's a 4-mana 3/3 menace, and when you swing with him, if the top card of your library is a land, you put it in tapped. If it's not, you get a goblin. So just kind of a aggressive sort of card. And then Yavimaya Iconoclast, 2-mana 3/2 trample. Pretty good body, you're not going to say no to that. But if you kick it for a red, then instead it comes in with a +1, it gets +1/+1 and haste until end of turn. So it's a 3-mana 4/3 haste, and then it's a 3/2 after that. So good stuff. Good red sort of ramp aggro deck. Next, we've got green-white tokens. So there's a lot of enlist in green, white, and red. It sort of travels over the Naya arc of the color pie. But here we've got Hexbane Tortoise, just a decent body with enlist. Argivian Cavalier, I think, is an insane common. It's 2 and a white for a 2/2 enlist, and when it comes in, you get a 1/1 white soldier, so you can enlist that soldier and make this a 3/2, or you can enlist something else, and the 2 bodies is really helpful. And then Queen Alanal of Ruadach is green and double white for a creature with power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control, and then if 1 or more creature tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a 1/1 white soldier token are created instead. So in layman's terms, essentially, whenever you make tokens, you get a bonus 1/1 white soldier. Kind of a Chatterfang thing going on here. And she's an uncommon. So, you play her, and then next turn you play something that gives you a token, you get an extra soldier, she gets bumped up to maybe 4/4. Now, obviously, she's not great by herself. If you're in top deck mode, she's a 3-mana 1/1. If you don't control anything else. But if you have a big board, she is really going to be... She might be a bit of a win-more card. It's hard to evaluate, but I'm excited to play with her. I think she's going to be pretty good. So that's the green-white tokens archetype. You're trying to go wide. You're trying to swing. And then as we move on to the enemy archetypes, the other 5, we have another sort of enlist-based archetype. We've got white-red enlist go wide. So this is another sort of tokens-based thing. We've got Cleaving Skyrider is an insane creature. It's 2/2 flash flyer for 3, and you can kick it for 3, which includes red. And if you do, it deals X damage to any target where X is the number of attacking creatures. You can flash it in on your opponent's combat and kill one of their attackers, or you can flash it in on your own combat before blockers and kill their biggest thing. And then Baird Argivian Recruiter is the 2-mana 2/2 at the beginning of your end step. If you control a creature with power greater than its base power, create a 1/1 white soldier. So basically, if you enlist and the enlisting creature survives, you're going to get a 1/1 on your end step, which is awesome from a bear. And then Balduvian Berserker is an enlist creature, and when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So it's sort of a crossover between the white-red and the black-red. But essentially, you buff it up. If they block it, it can kill another thing. Or it can hit them in the face. You make it a 7/3. I don't know what 6 power creature you're going to enlist. Let's be a little more realistic. You make it a 4/3. They trade it with their 4/4. You can hit them in the face for 4. It's like they didn't even block it. Or they trade it with their 4/4. You can kill another one of their creatures. So I think Balduvian Berserker is great. But essentially, this is the white-red enlist/go-wide archetype. Next, we've got, speaking of archetypes, I wish they would give a rest to red-blue Spellslinger. They've entertained like a red-blue draw your second card each turn. They've done some wizard, tribal, whatever. It's a hard color combination to come up with a more interesting identity for, so I'm sympathetic. But red-blue Spellslinger, you know it. Maybe you love it. We've got a 2-mana 1/2 trample that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell. We've got Djinn of the Fountain. There's a lot of text on this uncommon. It's a 6-mana 4/4 flyer. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you can choose to either buff it 1/1 until end of turn, or if they're targeting it with removal and you cast an instant in response, you can flicker it. Or when you wipe the board, you can flicker it with its trigger. It comes back on the end step, so it doesn't die. And then it's got Scry 1. So if it's not in a position to be doing combat, then scrying every time you do an instant or sorcery is pretty powerful. So that card's good. Essentially, the red-blue Spellslinger is what it always has been. cast as many instants and sorceries as possible and play cards that let you profit off of casting instants and sorceries. Then we've got blue-green land/domain. Now you'll notice this is very similar to the red-green archetype, where you're playing a lot of domain cards, you're playing a lot of things that care about the different number of basic land types that you control. And here we've got Pixie Illusionist. It's a 1/1 flyer for 1. You can kick it for 2 and a green or for 3 and a green, so 5 mana. It can be a 3/3 flyer. That's less than ideal, but you can tap it to make target land the basic land type of your choice until end of turn. So target land you control, sorry. So it can fix your mana potentially. It's not a mana dork. It doesn't increase the amount of mana that you make, but it does allow you to change the colors, and you can change your domain at instant speed. That's pretty powerful. You've got a creature swinging in that cares about the power that it has, or that cares about domain, and then they block. You can change the domain. It's got kind of a threat of activation on that. There's multiple creatures that have effects that change based on your domain. And then also, you can play some of those off-color kicker cards. So, you've got a green card that kicks for white, and you're not playing any white in your deck, but you've got one of these Pixie Illusionists. Boom. Now you turn one of your lands into a plains. Now you can pay that kicker cost. It's just nice to have. And then we've got, the Weather Seed Treaty. Does a lot of stuff, but the final thing it does is a buff based on domain. And then it also can grab a basic land type to increase your domain. Maybe if you get one of these, you put one off-color basic land in there just to pay a kicker cost and bump your domain up to 3 if you draw the Weather Seed Treaty. So very nice stuff. But this is a very flexible archetype. One thing I will say about this set broadly is that the archetypes are a lot more fluid than they are in a lot of sets. It's more of a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty situation where, you're not trying to build the red-green ramp deck or the black-white sack deck or whatever. You're trying to build a deck that utilizes some of these synergies, but you don't want to just fall into this is this archetype, this is that archetype. It's not like, say, Streets of New Capenna. So with that said, here's green-black domain/graveyard. There's some domain-carrying stuff in this archetype, but it also does a lot of graveyard stuff. So Bortuk Bone Rattle I want to highlight. This is the one of the 2 uncommon legendaries in black-green. He's a 6-mana 4/4. And when Bortuk enters the battlefield, only if you cast it, so you can't do any blink shenanigans, unfortunately, but when it comes in, you choose a creature card in your graveyard, and if its mana cost is less than your domain, you get to put it straight into play. Otherwise, you put it in your hand. Now, I think the domain part of this text is kind of a trap. You want to return the creature that's going to have the biggest impact on gameplay, and that's often going to be a 5 or 6 drop, and you're not going to have the domain to put it straight into play. So you just return it to your hand and cast it next turn, and you've got a 4/4 to sit behind, so you're not going to be dead. So I think Bortuk Bone Rattle is a very good card. It's a 6-mana 4/4 with a regrowth. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think you probably grab as many copies of this as you can. And Urborg Repossession is one of the cards I'm personally most interested in. The sort of return, the black return a creature from your yard to your hand thing that they do in every set. In Streets of New Capenna, you could there was one that casualtied, and there was one that returned one for each color. In Kaldheim, you could return 2 creatures that shared a creature type, stuff like that. I always love the variant of that in any given limited format, and I think Urborg Repossession is pretty powerful. You can kick it for green, and it normally just returns a creature, and you gain 2 life. But if you kick it, you also return another permanent card. So it's typically going to be a creature, but it could be the Planeswalker you were lucky enough to get, or it could be, an artifact or enchantment your opponent was able to destroy earlier. Or, like I said, typically it's just going to be a creature, but still, that's 3 mana for 2 creature cards from your graveyard back, and you gain 2 life, which is excellent at sorcery speed. And if you don't have that green to kick it with, it's a single black, return a creature, gain 2 life. That's respectable. So that's a card I'm personally really excited to play with. And then we've got our final archetype, Black-White Sacrifice, or kind of aristocrats type of feel. Now, they've ventured away from this in some sets recently, but it is still sort of the most common archetype to see in Black-White. Phyrexian Warhorse gives you something to sacrifice, a la Woe Strider, and then it lets you sack things to buff it, that sort of threat of activation. Elas Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim, is white and a black for a 2/2 with Death Touch at uncommon, legendary. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, so the Soul Sister text, and then whenever another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So this sort of Soul Sister, and also your opponent loses life when your stuff dies, and then also it's a great blocker. It's a 2/2 Death Touch for 2. So you're going to be gaining that life and having them lose that life as sort of incremental text, but then your opponent's swinging in with a 6/6, you can trade this with it. Great stuff. And there's just a lot of sort of, this overlaps a lot with the black-red sack, but just a lot of payoffs for sacrificing in ways to make little tokens. I think black-white sacrifice is a pretty good archetype. It goes great with that Cavalier that was within list that makes a 1/1 soldier. Just a lot of stuff to do here. It's a very wide-open archetype. So those are the archetypes, and next I think we're going to discuss the tips and tricks for this limited format. We're going to go over things I think it's important to remember or discuss. So first, we've got these tapped lands. I probably should have done this at the beginning of the video, but essentially it's just a cycle of 10 common, or they're going in the land slot, lands that have basic land types and come in tapped. And essentially, I want to just talk about when I think you should play these and when I think you shouldn't. Obviously, if you're in a 2-color deck and it's the same colors as yours, maybe you pick it if there's not much else good in the pack, and then it's fixing. It's assurance that you'll have access to both colors. 3 colors could be viable if you get 3 of these in your 3-color set. In which case, I'd be happy to play them. Now the domain decks, which a lot of the green decks are, or maybe you just have 1 or 2 cards that care about domain. If you put one of the off-color versions of these in your deck and you happen to draw it, that's going to increase all of your domains by 2. Now, is that worth the cost of essentially having a land that comes in tapped and taps for colorless mana? That's debatable. But if you have like 4 or 5 cards that care about domain, that gets significantly better if your domain is increased by 2. If you're playing a red-green deck with a lot of domain cards, but you you draft a black-white one of these lands, do you throw it in there? I think the answer is yes. A tapped land that taps for colorless hurts. It would hurt a lot more in constructed than it would in limited, but it still hurts in limited. But if it makes your Nishoba Brawlers 4/3s instead of 2/3s for 2, or if you get that bomb Mythic Sphinx and it lets you do an actual factor fiction when it hits the battlefield, then I think it's probably worth it. So keep these in mind when you're drafting and how they fit into your game plan is all I'm saying. The next sort of tip that I have also has to do with color, and it's, do you play these off-color kicker cards if you literally have no way to kick them? And if you include them, do you play 1 basic land of the kicker mana cost, just essentially as a colorless land in your deck, but that also lets you kick these? And I think, unsurprisingly, it depends on the card. You look at Heirloom Battle Hymn, that's just a great card. You can ignore the kicker, and it's a 3-mana instant, 4 damage. Awesome. But if you are playing a red-white deck, it has the potential to be a 4-mana instant, 4 damage, gain 4 life. That's crazy. That's better than that's like War Leader's Helix. And I think just the flexibility is great. If you're playing like a red-black deck and you want to put 1 planes in there, but this goes hand in hand with the lands we just talked about. If you're playing a red-black deck and you manage to draft one of the red-white tap lands and you have 1 or 2 Heirloom Battle Hymns, you put one of those tap lands in your deck for the chance to kick this. Maybe you don't play just a plains, but that's up to you. And then we'll look at Elvish Hydromancer, which I think is on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's 3 mana, 3/2. You kick for 3 and a blue. When it comes in, if it was kicked, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. So 7 mana for a 3/2 and a copy of another creature you control. It also has to target, so if they can remove it in response, you just get nothing. Which is less common in limited than constructed, but still something to worry about. This card is not worth playing unless you are already in blue-green. You don't put this in your deck if you're not in blue-green, and you certainly don't put blue in your deck to be able to kick this if you're just in green and whatever. So evaluate these cards. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't write off a card that you can't kick, because it might be a Heirloom Battle Hymn. It might need to be the kind of card that you don't need to kick in order for it to be a great removal spell or a great body or whatever. But evaluate it accordingly. And if you can kick it, then evaluate it like it's sometimes going to be kicked and sometimes not. For those people who haven't played with kicker, it's a lot like cycling in that it's a mechanic that really separates the players who are good at evaluating cards from the players who are not. Players who are sitting in a game with a spell they could cycle but like, what if they play that enchantment and I need to remove it? Like, really will lose a lot more games than players who are like, well, I don't have action right now and I need to cycle this and maybe to be good later, but I need something that's good now. And I think Kicker is the same way. You'll often give up opportunities early in the game to be able to get some added value off of Kicker later in the game when sometimes that's not the right option, or vice versa. It's just a very skill testing mechanic. So look out for these off-color Kicker cards. Put a little more effort into evaluating these because they demand it. They're almost like 2 cards. So now we're going to do what is some people's favorite part and just talk about the limited bombs. We are going to briefly exit the world of strictly commons and uncommons to discuss what rares and mythics I think are automatically includes just the best stuff in the format. So there's 2 levels of bomb. There's, if they don't answer it immediately, you win the game, which is a bomb, I think. And then there's, even if they answer it immediately, you're probably going to win the game. And when you've got a format like Crimson Vow was really notorious for having things like Halana and Elena and Dread of Fast Demon, where even rares, where even if they answer it, you're probably going to win the game. This format, like most very good formats, sort of eases back on those. Most of the bombs, especially at rare, are just, do you answer this immediately? If not, it gives me a huge advantage. And very few of them are, even if you answer this immediately, it's unlikely you'll win. But there are a few, so let's talk those. Sphinx of Clear Skies, I think, is the best card to have in this limited format. It's 3 and double blue for a 5/5 Sphinx at Mythic with flying and ward 2. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic lands types you have, and then an opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put 1 pile in your hand and the other into your graveyard. So essentially, it fact or fictions off of your domain. Now, it doesn't do this when it enters, but your opponent might not be prepared to answer a 5/5 with ward 2 right when this comes in. And if it gets to hit them once, you get to fact or fiction, even if you're just playing this in a 2-color deck. You get the best card off of the top 2. Your opponent's going to put them in 2 piles, so you're going to pick the best card. And then if you have 3 land types out, which is not unreasonable, especially on turn 5 if you're planning around getting domain up, then when this hits, they have to separate 3 cards into 2 piles. So maybe 1 pile has the land and the worst card, and the other pile has the better card, or 1 pile has 2 lands and the other pile has the card. Either way, you're digging 3 cards deep. So this card cannot be underestimated. It's very powerful. Then we've got the Cruelty of Gix, which is another card that I think they're going to be unable to answer typically, and it has Read Ahead. It's a 5-mana saga in black, 3 and double black. Step 1, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a creature or a planeswalker card from it. That player discards that card. Normally having this as Chapter 1 would make this a little worse in Limited, because if they don't have a hand, you have to just do Chapter 1 that doesn't do anything, but that Read Ahead lets you skip if they don't have a hand, or if you're not scared of anything they could play. Step 2, search your library for a card, put that card in your hand, then shuffle. You lose 3 life. It's a tutor, and you lose 3 life. That's a little significant. Especially, at 5 mana, that's a stage in the game where you might be a little more worried about your life total. But the fact that it can fetch a removal spell or a really good creature is insane. And then the third step, return target creature card from a graveyard to the battlefield under your control. So you can skip straight to this mode if you just want to reanimate something. But I think the typical play pattern with this is if they still have 2 or 3 cards in your hand, you just start on Chapter 1, Thoughtseize them, or I guess it would be Despise. And then next turn you fetch something relevant, a removal spell typically. And then next turn you fetch you reanimate a creature from your yard or their yard. This card just has so many options and it does so many things with each step. I think it's crazy good. And then we've got Archangel of Wrath, which was shown off very early in the spoilers. It's a 4-mana 3/4 angel at rare. You can kick it for a black and or a red. It's part of this cycle of sort of wedge kicker cards. 3/4 lifelink, flying. And when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, it deals 2 damage to any target. If it was kicked twice, it deals 2 damage to any target. So, essentially, when you cast this, you can kick it, and you get a black shock and a red shock. And worth noting, the Archangel of Wrath is what does the damage. So that damage has lifelink. So you are gaining life off of the kicker. So even if you can only kick this once, killing an opponent's creature and getting, like, they're killing their bear and getting a 3/4 flying lifelink and gaining 2 life is backbreaking. I think this card is an insane bomb. Next, we're moving on to the bombs that are like less immediately game winning, but still incredibly powerful. Quirion Beastcaller is a 2/2 Dryad Warrior for 2. Whenever you cast a creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on Quirion Beastcaller. Already pretty good. When Quirion Beastcaller dies, distribute its +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. So, you put 1 or 2 +1/+1 counters on this before it dies. It was a 2-drop, and then you also get to move those counters onto something else. So, backbreaking card. Then we've got Sarah Paragon. This is a 4-mana 3/4 angel flying. Once during each of your turns, you may play a land from your graveyard or cast a permanent spell with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. If you do, it gains, when this permanent is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, exile it and you gain 2 life. So essentially, it makes those cards sort of bound to exile, but it's kind of like a Luris, except I think the body is better and the mana value 3 or less is a lot less restrictive. And, in limited, typically you're not going to have lands in the graveyard unless you've put them there somehow. But, that's relevant. The point is, they trade with your creatures early in the game. You drop this, they don't answer it. You just cast them from the graveyard again. It's insane card advantage. And when they leave, you gain 2 life. It's just a little bonus. So Sarah Paragon is very powerful mythic. And then we've got Defiler of Vigor. Now, this is a part of the Defiler cycle. It's 3 and double green for a 6/6 Phyrexian Worm with Trample at rare. As an additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost a green less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of green mana you pay. What that means in less words is essentially all your green permanent spells, one of their green mana is a Phyrexian green mana. And then, whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So, 5 mana 6/6 Trample, that's just a cheaper Colossal Dreadmaw. And then, the bonus of being able to cast with Phyrexian mana is not going to come up that often in Limited. Typically, you can afford to pay for the spell if you've already cast this. But either way, when you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That's not only Defiler of Vigor, which would then make it a 7/7 Trample, the first time you cast another creature spell with it out, but also any other creatures you have out all get +1/+1 counters. So this card is insane. It's going to very quickly take over the game if it's not answered. Then we've got Jaya, Fiery Negotiator. This card wants too many different things to see play in Constructed, but it does exactly what a great Planeswalker in Limited should do, which is make bodies, protect itself, generate card advantage. It does everything. It's 2 and double red for a legendary mythic Planeswalker. Jaya comes in with 4 loyalty. You can +1 it to create a 1/1 red monk creature token with prowess. You can -1 to exile the top 2 cards of your library. Choose one of them. You might play that card this turn. -2, choose target creature an opponent controls. When you attack this turn, Jaya deals damage equal to the number of attacking creatures to that creature. So that's a lot of text, but, it's a roundabout removal. It's a little awkward. -8, you get an emblem with whenever you cast a red instant or sorcery spell, copy it twice. You may choose new targets for the copy. So obviously don't evaluate a Planeswalker on their ultimate. But the +1 make a 1/1 on a 4/4 Planeswalker, classically very good. And then the fact that, if you really need gas, this filters, this is like filtered impulse draw and roundabout removal. I think this card's good and limited. Then we've got the Phasing of Zhalfir. 2 and double blue for a rare saga, read ahead. Chapters 1 and 2 phase out a non-land permanent you control. Or sorry, just another target non-land permanent phases out. It can't phase in for as long as you control the Phasing of Zhalfir. And then the third chapter is Destroy All Creatures. For each creature destroyed this way, its controller creates a 2/2 black Phyrexian creature token. There's a lot of ways you can take this. I think often what you're going to be doing is, if the board wipe is kind of immediately needed, but not super immediately, you're going to play this on 2, protect your best thing, and then on their next turn, they can't really play any more creatures because they're just going to get blown up and turned into 2/2s. But on your turn, this triggers, blows up the board, everything becomes a 2/2, you get your thing back on the following turn. So I think this card is pretty powerful. Just the fact that, especially if you have a board full of like 1/1 soldier tokens or whatever, and they have real creatures, you blow this up, your things practically get a buff, and then their things just become 2/2s, which is what you have. This card just has a lot of flexibility. It's a 4-mana board wipe, but it also just does so many other things if that's not what you need right now. And then we've got Silverback Elder. This is a mythic. This card's great. This is 2 and triple greens, so a 5/7 Ape Shaman mythic. Whenever you cast a creature spell, choose one. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land into the battlefield tapped, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, or you gain 4 life. Never are any of these going to be irrelevant. Worth noting, it's a 5-mana 5/7. If they blow it up immediately, it doesn't do anything. But if they don't, that's an insane body for 5-mana unlimited. And then on your turn, you play another creature. If they've got an artifact or enchantment, blow it up. If you want your domain to be bigger, I guess, or you have like a 7-drop in your hand for some reason, grab a land. If not, just gain 5 life. If they were aggroing you out before you played this, they're not going to be anymore. You slam this guy down, and then every time you play another creature spell, you just gain 4 life. So the Silverback Elder is a very, very powerful ape, and I will always be happy if I get to play one of these in draft or sealed. I love this card. I'm very excited to include it in my cube. With that said, this has been my guide to Dominaria United. I thank you a lot for watching, and as always, I hope you'll give me comments. Give your thoughts on what you think this limited format will be like. What are you excited to draft? What are you excited to open at pre-release? What do you think will be really powerful in this limited format? Is there anything you think I overlooked? Anything you think I overrated? I love discussions in my comments. And of course, if you don't mind, it would mean a lot to me if you decided to like or subscribe. Either way, I wholeheartedly hope that you enjoy Dominaria United Limited. I hope I do as well. And I hope y'all have an excellent day. Genuinely, thank you so much for watching.